Move on to the next item on the agenda, which is the Citizen Oversight Panel, who are here to make a presentation on the North Shore Alternatives Task Force report. And so Stuart Sherman, I think, is coming up, and Josh Benelow. You aren't on my list, but Josh, welcome. Stuart, welcome.
Good afternoon, Chair McCarthy and board members. I'm Stuart Sherman, the current chair of your Citizen Oversight Panel, and with me today is Josh Benelow, your vice chair of COP. Today, the Citizen Oversight Panel is transmitting the results of our North Shore Alternative Task Force study. Josh was the chair of this task force and will be presenting a summary of this report. I also want to make a few introductory comments regarding our report. The COP members are very sympathetic to the sense of ownership, pride, and equity that Sounder North represents to Snohomish County. In a decade of development and operation, riders have grown to appreciate having the service, as citizens have stated clearly that they value having both the train and the bus service alternatives. We also took note, especially of the letter dated April 17, 2012, from the mayors of Everett, Mukilteo, and Edmonds in support of continuing Sounder North service. These are real and meaningful values, and COP shares them. However, we also appreciate the frustrations of many riders who arrive at the Linwood, Ashway, and Montlake Terrace Transit Center every weekday morning and cannot get a seat on the bus or cannot even board due to severe overcrowding. We appreciate the frustration of commuters having to live with an overloaded trips, lack of parking, lack of feeder service to the regional system. We appreciate the irritation of taxpayers who see an inefficient and unbalanced allocation of resources to one mode that is underutilized while another is overloaded. We believe that Sound Transit and board must seriously consider this situation. We also believe that in the long term, the taxpayers and transit users of Snohomish County will not be well served if the high-cost Sounder North continues to run well below capacity, while the much lower cost ST Express bus routes run overloaded with passengers standing in the aisle. At a certain point in the future, Sound Transit may have to come to terms with the reality that one of its services is not living up to a reasonable definition of viability. Thus, our recommendations call on agencies to make a three-part commitment to evaluate, develop, and fine-tune of Sounder North, and Josh will present this in a little bit more detail. COP is not suggesting that Sound Transit dismantle the existing North Sounder service. And we repeat this. COP is not suggesting that Sound Transit dismantle the existing North Sounder service. We recognize it is a popular service among its riders and a value to the communities it serves. We also recognize that the kind of accountability that COP is recommending is not easy and is not without cost. We do believe that accepting the status quo on low ridership and high costs on North Sounder is not acceptable. Sound Transit should undertake proactive efforts to continue to bring costs down and to build ridership so that Snohomish County taxpayers can be assured that their investments are purchasing real value to regional mobility, their communities, and people's lives. I want to thank all of our members which were part of this task force, and especially Kathy Elias for her long hours getting the facts and putting it all together. We will try to answer any questions you may have after Josh's summary. Thank you.
Thank you.
Stuart. There we go. I can figure that. I'll keep it going. Thanks, Stuart. And thank you, Chair McCarthy and board members, for taking the time and your attention to hear about our findings and recommendations. I'd like to begin by describing why it is that the Citizen Oversight Panel decided to look into this issue. Several of our members are residents of Snohomish, and we heard frequent anecdotal reports from our Snohomish members about the overcrowded buses and how difficult the situation was. During that time, we also received briefings from Sound Transit staff that included information about Sounder North service and how underutilized that service was. And after several months of going back and forth, hearing about overcrowded buses and underutilized rail, we eventually decided that we should look a little bit further, and the more we looked, the more we realized that there were significant issues here, and we decided to form the task force to study this issue in depth. I also want to reiterate Stuart's comments about our respect for sub-area equity and its importance, as well as the importance of this service to the communities in Snohomish, especially Everett, Mukilteo, and Edmonds. Now, I want to continue and just give a brief description of the history of Sounder North. I'm sure board members recall that Sound Transit spent $258 million to purchase easements for 4 round-trip trains from Everett to Seattle per day. In total, with the $258 million initial, there were additional expenditures to improve stations and other fixed assets. So the total investments on stationary assets were more than $300 million. But despite this very substantial initial investment, there were investments that were excluded, left out, especially additional stations and some amenities. And our view, our concern is that the initial investment was not complete in the sense that it didn't realize the potential of the line to bring in as many riders as possible for the large initial investment. The current conditions on the line are certainly below par. The ridership is less than 1/2 of the initial Sound Move estimates, low-end estimates, for 2010 ridership. That's worth understanding and thinking about carefully, because the initial ridership estimates ranged from 2,400 up, and the ridership has been below 1,200, and we're after several years after 2010 now. The operating cost of moving a passenger from Everett Station to King Street Station here in Seattle by rail is more than 6 times what it is to move the same passenger here by bus. So our principal conclusion from those basic facts is that we are forced to question the status quo and whether the status quo is sustainable. We believe that the board should be proactive in trying to reduce costs and build ridership if the service is to continue. One of our recommendations is the establishment of metrics in order to have a better understanding of the success of the service. We examined many metrics that were possible and settled on 3 as the most valuable. Total ridership, of course, is the most important. Also, operating cost per rider is a very important thing to track, and the fare box recovery rate. It's important to track more than one metric because these metrics are manipulable. For instance, by reducing the fare to 0, total ridership and cost per rider would likely go down. Well, total ridership would likely go up substantially. Operating cost per rider would likely go down substantially, but fare box recovery rate would, of course, drop. Therefore, to have a successful service, all 3 of these metrics have to be considered. We recommend, as our principal recommendation to the board, that the board work with staff to have these metrics carefully tracked and to establish targets for these metrics and triggered actions that will be taken if these targets are not met by date certain. So to be as specific as possible without including numbers, which we are reluctant to do, we urge the board to establish a variety of triggers of the form, if this metric is not achieved by this date, then a particular action will take place. And we think that the board should be doing that now, as soon as possible. Some of the possible actions that could be triggered are reducing the number of passenger cars per train. There are now 3 passenger cars. There are reasons, we're told, why it can't go below 2. And there are already plans next year to move some of the passenger cars from North Sounder to South. It's not decided as yet, we're told, how many, but certainly the possibility of reducing all of the trains to 2 passenger cars per train set is a possibility. Another possible action is to reduce the number of daily round trips from 4 down to 3 or even 2. And of course, a final option is to shift the resources from Sounder North to ST Express service to better serve the riders of Snohomish. Now, once these triggers and actions are in place, we should discuss how the service can be improved. And we settled on 7 possible mechanisms for improving ridership. There is substantial cost to some of them, but actually many of them are very low cost. And we've listed them in rough order of increasing cost. So the first possibility for increasing ridership is working with the BNSF on reliability. We understand that the BNSF has received a grant to reduce, to improve stabilization of the shore line and therefore improve reliability somewhat. Reliability has, in the past, seemed to have a substantial impact, a negative impact on ridership. We note in particular, though, that the stabilization work that will be done is not enough to ensure complete reliability. We are concerned that Sound Transit is not getting the full benefit of the easements that have been purchased from BNSF because of these issues of lack of reliability, and wonder out loud to some extent whether it may be possible to improve this. In particular, I'm sure you're all aware of the 48-hour rule, which says that passenger service cannot be resumed until 48 hours after a mudslide. It's not well known that this is not a federal transportation rule. This is a BNSF rule. And although safety must be paramount, if safety can be achieved with a shorter time period, this is worth exploring. Right now, the effect of the 48-hour rule is for BNSF to give itself priority to clear a backlog of freight traffic before resuming passenger service. And we wonder about looking more carefully at legal means of trying to get better value for the easement and saying that Sound Transit and Sounder North must have better access, perhaps a shorter delay after clearing a mudslide. The next item we looked at is targeted advertising. This has been employed to some extent in the Everett area, where there is ample parking available and the opportunity to bring in additional riders, and the initial results seem promising. Target advertising could serve in other markets where there is capacity, but as I'll talk about briefly in a moment, capacity must be established before the marketing take place. Another area where there may be improvements is schedule alignment with feeder bus service and especially with ferries. We've been told that synchronization with ferry schedules is difficult, but it turns out that Sounder service is already quite well synchronized with ferry service. But synchronized is not the same as being aligned with service. A cursory look at schedules shows that the afternoon Sounder service from Seattle north, all of the 4 stops at Mukilteo are 13, or in one case, 15 minutes before a connecting ferry, which seems quite good. And 2 of the 4 stops at Edmonds also are 13 minutes before a connection. However, in the morning, from Mukilteo, the Sounder train is scheduled to depart Mukilteo exactly 6 minutes after ferry arrival, and 2 of the 4 Sounder train departures from Edmonds also depart exactly 6 minutes after ferry arrivals. Perhaps 6 minutes is enough to make a reliable connection. We question that, and we think it's worth exploring this more carefully. The possibility of delaying the morning schedules by 5 minutes to increase that connection time by 5 minutes should be explored as a way of improving service for people who are taking the ferry from Clinton and Kingston, which already offer park and ride service. One would think that many riders who are now driving onto ferries and then driving off the ferries and driving downtown would have a much less expensive and perhaps a much better ride if they could reliably connect with Sounder service in both directions. And it doesn't seem that they can do that now, and minor adjustments might make that possible. It's worth noting that although these residents presumably live outside of the Sound Transit District, they presumably work within the district and therefore pay taxes, sales taxes within the district. So it's completely reasonable that they avail themselves of this service, and it's a win for everybody if they are not bringing their cars onto the ferry and into downtown Seattle, but instead taking the train. In addition, if the service alignment is achieved, this is a very good opportunity for additional targeted advertising. It's hard to imagine a better target audience than a set of drivers who are sitting in their cars waiting to board a ferry. These drivers could be offered some inducement to, on subsequent trips, perhaps get a fare discount card of some sort that would induce them to try riding the ferry as a pedestrian instead. Another ridership improvement that we think is worth considering is fare reductions. The initial Sound Move projections for ridership assumed that the fares by rail and by bus would be the same, and they are not. The bus fares between Seattle and Snohomish County destinations, full fare is $3.50. The Sounder fare between Seattle and Edmonds is $3.50. Mukilteo is $4. Everett is $4.50. Riders in Everett are choosing to take the bus over the train from the same departure point where it's cheaper and faster to downtown. And the possibility of reducing fares to at least match the same level, so it's $3.50 uniform everywhere, or whatever the level is uniform, should be considered. The cost would be relatively small, probably between $100,000 and $150,000 annual lost revenues from farebox if all riders are paying full fare, which presumably they're not. But this would then shift some number of riders, we hope many riders, to the trains, and therefore make more bus service available, make the bus service more amenable, and perhaps attract more passengers, not just to the train, but more new riders to Sound Transit services all down the line, not just in Everett, but in Ashway, in Montlake Terrace, in Linwood, and therefore bring in more riders to the system, and it wouldn't take many more riders at all to recover the fare loss. Ironically, reducing the fare would certainly, or almost certainly, increase ridership and reduce the cost per rider. It might even improve the fare box recovery rate. That's somewhat counterintuitive, but if enough new riders are taking the train because of that. We also think it's worth considering the possibility of reducing fares even further, below the bus rate, if that's what's necessary to bring riders onto the the service and make good use of the initial investment. The next recommendations for exploration, for ridership improvement, start to get more expensive. Providing more parking is very important. There is sufficient parking in Everett. There is not sufficient parking in Mukilteo and Edmonds. And we think it's very important to provide more parking so that more riders can be brought in from these destinations. In some sense, there are two ridership issues. There's the Everett service, where there is ample parking, but the service is more expensive and somewhat slower than the train in most cases. And then there's the Edmonds and Mukilteo situations where the service is somewhat of a premium service. It gets to downtown faster and more comfortably, but there isn't sufficient parking to handle any additional local riders. And the current stations are not very amenable to pedestrian or bicycle traffic. So providing additional parking, we think, would be an important way of achieving additional ridership. And although it's somewhat controversial to say so, we think that since the communities of Edmonds and Mukilteo enjoy this premium service benefit, that it's reasonable to ask them to partner in providing this additional parking, bear some of the costs, even if the parking is at least partially used by residents outside of these communities coming into these communities to park. This is a value. The service is a value to these communities, and it's fair to ask these communities to share in the cost. Next item on the list is enhancement of station amenities for pedestrian and bike access. We think this is something that could also improve ridership. And the final item, which is more of a long-term item because the costs are much higher, is construction of additional stations, especially a North Seattle station, because right now riders are coming in all the way to the King Street Station. Many of them work in downtown Seattle, so they have to get on a bus and turn around and go back north. And if there were a North Seattle station access, then it would be a faster and more convenient ride for many commuters to Seattle. So our final comments is that we believe that doing nothing is not an option here. Inaction is not acceptable. Sounder North needs attention. Now, how much investment is needed versus how much attention, as I've said, some of these items are fairly low cost, perhaps even no cost at all. But it can't be allowed to just continue as it is with no attention. And we urge the board to work with staff to find strategies to improve ridership and to set some of these explicit targets and triggered actions that will take place if these targets are not met. Thank you very much for your time and attention, and Stuart and I would be happy to try to address any questions that may come up. Thank you.
Very good. Are there any questions by any board members? Oh, I see a couple. Paul and then Larry.
Thank you, Madam Chair. First, I really appreciate the work that the COP did in looking in some more detail at these issues, and this is consistent with the discussion I know that Joni and I have had, and that subsequently some discussions with the mayors. Joni pulled together a meeting with the mayors of Everett, Mukilteo, and Edmonds to have a discussion about these issues, and so I appreciate that. At least for me as a writer, as well as a citizen of Everett, the landslides question, the parking question, and the location question are the ones that I consistently hear and also experience myself as a writer. There's no question which of the two is preferable in terms of the ride. The ridership experience of the train is great. Not to take anything away from our buses, which are also very good, but I get to get on the bus first. I get to watch everyone else stand by the time it gets to Seattle, so it just depends on which one I take. And so I think you hit the right issues. And I guess I would just say as a question, maybe more to the board than to the panel, I would hope, and Joni, you did such a great job in pulling together the mayors before, I think it would be appropriate to have a follow-up discussion with them now with this report in hand as well, and a little more substance to the discussion that we had. So I would hope that we would do that and begin to look at the options that are available. And last but not least, the question of that additional station. I know that was one that was looked at, and Joni, you mentioned it, that there were just some physical constraints in, for instance, a Broad Street station, but I would hope that we would not take that off the table too early, because by the time, in this timeline, by the time we would get at that discussion, it may be overtaken by events in terms of the real opportunity. So it seems to me that it's an earlier, not a later discussion in terms of viability. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Great. Larry.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And just to echo Paul's initial comments about the great work that's been done here. This was an issue that we needed to spend some time with, and so the work that you've done and the recommendations that you've made with regard to ridership are very helpful. But I need to ask, again, in the context of the direct link between land use and transportation, specifically with some of the recommendations you've made here and expanding beyond that with regard to land use. I didn't see anything here with regard to transit-oriented development either at or near the stations, or done in such a way to provide easy bus linkages to the existing stations, perhaps enhanced stations, in a way in which more people, in terms of improving ridership, would be able to avail themselves of this, what is otherwise a really wonderful transit system in terms of the riders who are using it today. So if we're really going to enhance our investment, and if we're really going to get ridership up, it seems like in terms of density, you want to be able to provide that land use link in a way in which more people would avail themselves of this part of our system and then reduce the cost per rider. But I didn't see that here. I didn't know if that was beyond your scope of what you were looking at. But it seems like, again, in terms of getting the greatest bang for the buck of this public transportation investment, we should be, again, looking at TOD as one of the key elements to do that in terms of ridership improvement.
Yeah,
Sure.
I agree. That's a fair point, and perhaps we should have brought that into the scope of the report. Certainly, that would be one way of increasing the ridership. And I think I can safely speak for the COP in that's something that I think we consider a valuable option as a way to bring up ridership in the service.
Yep.
Madam Chair, I'm seeing nodding heads, and just to follow up on Paul's comments then, to the extent that we move this forward and we're serious about attending to this issue, I think we're going to have to fold that into our consideration as well. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Julia, and then Dave.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I don't know if I should address this to Stuart or to Joni, but I notice in your report that you say on page 2 that since the study was completed last year, that the trend on North Sounder has improved considerably. In fact, it says that mid-year ridership as of the second quarter was up 19%. Mm-hmm. That's quite a jump. So I'm curious to know why have things improved so much in the last year?
I think I think there's kind of 2 points to this, and feel free for you all to jump in on this. There is the near-term ridership growth. We have been doing. We did a bunch of research and advertising promotion, targeted some incentivizing with fare cards, and we actually looked at where we could get information, where people generally work, to find out what's the potential market. And we've done some concentrated work up there, and I think that's part of it. I think that the fact that we didn't have the mudslide issue is really significant. And we have seen historically that after we had like 40 trips a couple years ago that were wiped out with mudslides, and then we saw a drop in ridership, and it's hard to get them back because back to the reliability question. So we've really worked at, we worked at trying to build the ridership. There were some station improvements that have happened. We're actually in negotiations and near completion on leasing parking at Edmonds. I think if Board Member Erling was here, he would be describing for you, and it would kind of crosswalk between Board Member Phillips' statements. Also, in that the city of Edmonds has a master plan now for TOD right around the commuter rail station. And while that's in development, we've been talking to one of the adjacent property owners to our station to lease parking because we do have a parking problem. I think you've been seeing regular emails from citizens at Edmonds about there's not enough parking or parking's full by the second train. So there's a series of things, Board Member Patterson, that I think has helped us start to turn the curve, but we're still below, to their bottom line point, we're below what our projections were in Sound Move.
Right, but a 19% jump in 1 year, the only thing that's happened in the past year, you have these other plans coming forward, but is your outreach and your advertising, is that what's bounced the number up?
I'll say that I was very surprised to see how sensitive the ridership was to the reliability in mudslides, how much of an impact mudslides had. So the service has been more reliable recently, and that seems to account for, I believe, a large portion of that increase. It's a restoration of some of the ridership that vanished when reliability was poor.
Okay. Dave?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I guess I would reiterate how nice that service is and why I would understand why Snohomish County would not want to let it go, because that train service is really, really nice. I was telling Mary about that just a while ago. She's ready to take it down from Lakewood. I'm hoping that if we look at how to make that a little more robust, we also look at the potential to serve Ballard and Interbay, as well as Broad Street. That had been part of the conversation initially when that went in, and the Ballard station particularly was just bypassed. But if you want more riders, it sure looks like a good place to get some. So I hope that doesn't escape us on that, as we look forward to fixing that. So keep up the good work and figure out a way to make that work better. Don't lose the service.
All right. Any other board members want to make any comments? Seeing none, on behalf of all of the board members, I want to let you know that we appreciate the North Shore Area Task Force hard work in reviewing our North Line Sounder service and the costs and the ridership. On behalf of all of us, I appreciate that it's constructive, and that's always helpful. Sound Transit, as you both know, has invested a great deal into building and operating Sounder North, and improving ridership and access to North Line service remains really a top priority. Not to be a wet blanket, but we are going to be talking about the budget forecast, and it is somewhat grim, but that doesn't mean that we won't come back after reviewing the task force recommendations and respond to its findings sometime, hopefully next month. So we'll come back and have you come back, both of you come back, so that we can make a report. And so thank you both, and thank your colleagues on behalf of the board for the good work that you've done, and your insight and your opinions. And so thank you very much, Mr. Sherman and Mr. Benelow. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. We're going to move on to the next item on the agenda.